Welcome everyone to this week's official Blitz.js meetup. So good to see you all. And we have some awesome talks lined up for you. But first, we will have a word from Patrick, who is one of our level 1 maintainers.
Hey guys, some of you might already have seen it. I'm writing a book about Blitz.js right now. Unfortunately, my co-author wasn't very reliable. So the publisher and I decided that I will continue the book alone for the moment. But it would be really great to get another co-author. Right now, a lot of the groundwork is already done for the book. We have a very nice outline. The book is divided in 2 parts. We will start with a simple application where we explain simple topics about Blitz, like mutations, queries, and so on. And the second part, we planned doing some more advanced stuff, like sending emails, connecting to Stripe, and so on. So yeah, since I'm working full-time while writing this book, it would be really cool to get some help here. And I think it might be very overwhelming to sign up for it, to write half a book. So on Monday, I talked to the publisher and they told me, yeah, if you find some people who just want to write one chapter, this would be fine as well. So yeah, the shout out in this round here, it would be great. I can post the outline if we find some people who can assist me and maybe just write 1 chapter. Working with Pact, it's a publisher, it's really great so far and you get really great feedback. So even if you don't know right now how to write a chapter, I didn't know how to write a book in the beginning as well, but they have very good material that goes into detail, how to structure your chapter, how to structure the book. And you can send them your first draft and you get a lot of feedback, which really helped me as well to make my chapters better. So yeah, would be really cool if I could get some help there. And if someone is interested, just shoot me a message on Discord and we can talk about it.
Cool, thank you, Patrick. And also, I am looking for a freelancer to help me on a client project indefinitely for 20 to 30 hours per week, preferably non-US based because of budgeting constraints. If you're interested in that, message me. I also posted in the Blitz Discord jobs channel about this. And I'm hoping to get someone to start as soon as possible, like maybe next week. So this will probably fill up fast. And if you're watching this recorded later, it's probably already filled. So don't even worry about it. All right. Next up is Myron Davis, another one of our level 1 maintainers. He has a lightning talk for us. So take it away, Myron.
Hey guys, let me just share my screen.
Yep, we got it.
So, all right, so I'm gonna be doing a super quick talk about using Blitz in a microservices architecture. Actually struggled a little bit with coming up with a topic. I don't know who was early on the call, but this is the first time I'm actually having giving a talk to a bunch of developers. For some reason, it made me very nervous because I felt like probably a lot of the guys on the call know a lot more about me than about JavaScript, and you'll hear why in a second. But I mean, I'm gonna give it my best shot, and let's go. So, just to tell you a little bit of this is just an outline. I'm gonna introduce myself a little bit, and I'll talk about why use Blitz in a microservices architecture, and a couple of considerations. And I have questions there, but probably I'll just end there if there's nothing to ask. So about me, I'm a Jamaican living in the UK. I've been living here for almost 5 years now. For my day job, I'm a search consultant. So work for a company called LucidWorks, and they have a commercial product around solar. Actually, probably around 90% of the solar committers actually work for the company. So I work with search systems for the past 8+ years. So Solar, Elasticsearch, Algolia, and a couple of other other products that are out there, both open source and commercial. I'm a developer and an entrepreneur of a small company, a friend of mine in Jamaica, hoping to do that full time soon. And as I said, level 1 maintainer. I'm really a Java developer at heart, but over the past year, call it 2 years, I've kind of been cheating on Java a little bit, getting into JavaScript development, Node.js a little bit more. All right. So why am I talking about this, right? So I'll be switching back and forth through the Blitz documentation, but it's in the documentation really where Blitz is a full stack monolith application. That monolith is the opposite of microservices, depending on how you do it, but just off the bat, there's a huge difference between the two in terms of what you're trying to achieve. And it's a zero API, as you know. So when using Blitz, the aim is to try to not use an API if you don't need to. You talk to your database directly, and you use the queries, your queries and your mutators in order to update your data. So it's everything in one place that should make things pretty simple, right? So those things don't work very well in a microservice architecture where you'll have different services that handle specific functions. And specifically, I had this problem when I started using Blitz and I wanted to use it to replace an Angular frontend, where Angular was just the front end, and we had 3 different services, and we're going to continue to break them out into separate services. We had a core API, which had most of the logic. We had something for accounts, user management, and we had something for managing billing, right? And each of those services had their own database, right? So, getting Blitz into that, it doesn't really work. It wouldn't be easy to easily have Blitz talk directly to the databases. There's a lot of logic that existed in the API servers. So, that's really the problem here of why I wanted to quickly chat about this. So why use Blitz at all? Why not just, you stick with Angular or, use something else? And I have here as a first thing, like, in my opinion, I feel like React is the best framework for web development. Just everything that I've seen with it, there's a lot of considerations around, making your web application performant. There's a consideration about how the users interact with the application and trying to make a good experience for them. And I believe that Next.js is the best production-ready React framework that's out there, again, in my opinion. And, Blitz is wrapped around those 2 things. So the other benefits that come with Blitz that for me it was almost like a must. And I'll switch to documentation again since it had the details. The code scaffolding is one of the things I really loved. Because I've used Blitz in like 2 or 3 situations where I had to do a POC and I didn't have a lot of time to do development. So I spun it up quickly, created something with an SQLite database, and I had an interface ready to demo something in like a couple of hours, right? So that was very important to me, as well as the fact that I tell you that I have a small company. I look forward to being able to create like templates so we can generate specific type of pages for doing things that we always do repeatedly. The recipes, like creating recipes for different things. So yeah, Blitz is great, even though for some projects I had a couple of limitations. So I decided to try to find a way to make it work. Now, there are 3 main things that I had to think about when porting it over. And again, I think this is good because of all of the things that Blitz provided, there wasn't a lot of worry, right? But because Blitz is a little bit opinionated, the things that I really needed to kind of get around was authentication, authorization, and the fact that we had existing services and how we're gonna talk to those. So for authentication, we were using Keycloak. For any of you guys that don't know, Keycloak is an open source alternative to Auth0. It basically does the exact same thing, pretty much. So we were using Keycloak throughout our entire architecture for other services. One of them written in Kotlin, two of them written in Java. We're using Keycloak there, and we're using it in Angular. So needed to make sure that Blitz was able to use the same JWT authentication for when we were talking to the services, making sure that the user is logged in. There is partial support, I'd say, for getting this to work because Blitz has Passport.js within. You can set up Keycloak, and I've gotten that to work. And the only reason why I say partial is because of how the session works is a little bit dependent on a database. I think there are ways around it that actually I haven't, when I touched that, it was still in experimental, so there might be a few changes that I'm not aware of. But definitely, if you want to get authentication to work, you'll have to go into session management and look at handling how sessions are created, how you get the session information, and how you update that. And think about the fact that all your session information is going to be in a token as opposed to in a database. And when your token expires, being able to refresh that and keep in sync. Right. Authorization is also something to take in consideration. For us, for the application that I was porting, we didn't have roles inside of the token. So that it was a little bit, we had to kind of create something to get the permissions that we needed so that they could be applied on the back end. Also in the Angular application, we kind of did all of the authorization work there. And that the way that Blitz work, or the recommendation, is to protect the data as opposed to trying to protect things on the front end. So thinking about how you're gonna apply authorization using payload from the token, that's something that you need to consider. And lastly, the different services. And funny enough, the topic I'd come up with first was around this tool I found called GraphQL Mesh. And I realized I probably was gonna talk about that for 2 minutes. Wouldn't make up a lightning talk, so I added some more. But I did a workshop the other day where they talked about this tool called GraphQL Mesh. I don't know if any of you guys are aware of it, but what it allows you to do is basically put together or combine existing data sources into one, GraphQL service. And when I say existing data sources, this can be a REST API, a GraphQL API, directly to a database, and multiple others. And it's actually really simple. I have a quick example. Here's a page. I can send a link in the Slack afterwards of the guys that did this. They're the guild, and they have a couple of different open source projects. But the mesh specifically, there's, come on, get away. There's a GitHub project that is a really good example of how simple it works. And what they have is a configuration of two completely separate public REST API services, where there's the JDB and Open Brewery. And basically what they've done is combine these two sources into one, into GraphQL, so you can query them as if it's one data source. They've added a resolver that kind of joins the data. So using the name of the brewery, they'll go and find, getting the name, searching for a brewery by name, you get back city locations, and you use that to search for, GeoDB information, basically. I kind of join them together, and I'll show you just in a second. But what I wanted to highlight was, for anybody, what was really great for my scenario was, for our Java services, we are using Swagger to document our APIs, and there's a handler for Open API. So really all you do here is point it to your documentation, and this can be a local file as well. And the Swagger configuration can have a base URL, but you can specify another one if you want that overrides it. And this will generate operations for every endpoint that you have, as well as types for all of your for your schema, which also can be used in your project, kind of similarly to how Prisma generates types based on your database. And yeah, so this just a quick example. I already did a checkout right before the call and spun it up. And just based on the configuration, you see that in here, there's absolutely no code. These are just samples of JSON that are required by one of the handlers, but there's literally no code. It's just this configuration here in the mesh rc.yaml. And that allows you to do something like, if I say London, it will give me breweries in London, just connecting those two data sources. So this is something that I was able to use to connect or account services with the core service that had, the core data with what we're working on. As well as when needed, things like, getting data from the billing service, and this, that will be available for any new service that we add. I haven't fully completed the implementation yet for, using Blitz, but it's definitely possible. And those were the major things that I ran into, and yeah, that's it.
Awesome, Myron. If you wouldn't have told me that this was your first meetup presentation, I would have thought you've done this 100 times. You did excellent.
All right, thank you, man.
So yeah, very good. That was very cool. The GraphQL mesh, I'd never heard about that, so that was pretty slick. I wonder if we could build an adapter or something that would that we could point it to a Blitz app, and it would convert the Blitz RPC endpoints into a GraphQL endpoint for mobile apps.
That's a good idea. I think that would be a handler based on what I've seen with the documentation, creating a handler for getting all of that. I've also seen projects out there where you can add Swagger, you can generate Swagger documentation pages for Node.js projects. Yeah. So that's also which
is a bit tricky for us because it's not really set up for RPC.
Yeah, that's something to look into. I'll jot that down.
So, Jeremy, I think, is maybe the expert here on this. I'm not sure, but at least more than me. So something to investigate.
Yeah. Okay.
But yeah, this is something that we tried to tackle already, and I guess it's interesting that we have a new angle to possibly approach it now with that mesh.
Yeah,
we can definitely chat about that. And I really like the mesh, man. It's pretty cool. And I've always liked GraphQL for front-end development. I think it's perfect.
Cool. And then just one comment on the code scaffolding, Myron. Definitely, there's so much. I want it to be so much better, 100 times better than it is now. And hopefully we'll be able to get working on that, so you can have custom templates so that it actually uses code that you want. And then like you said, adding extra entities, so let's generate component or whatever you want to add, and you can just add those templates. So yeah, so we'll take maybe just one or two questions here if anyone has for Myron.
It was the easy
Just
button.
actually,
Oh,
one
okay.
quick thing. I'm curious. So you're trying very hard to migrate your existing workflow to one which matches Blitz.
Right.
And what size development team do you have working on that?
One.
Okay.
Literally, it's a huge project. We had a couple of developers on Upwork, but they just didn't really work out. So we kind of took a step back to fix a couple of the issues that kind of came up because of the multiple developers. So it's mainly been me working on the front end side, and my counterpart, who I thought was going to join this call, is probably on. He's working on the back end API. It's kind of two, but for front end, it's really just me.
Oh wow, this is a perfect use case for something like Blitz, then, right? You
Yeah.
able to move very quickly.
Right.
With a small developer team. It's good. Nice one, mate.
Cool. Well, let's move on to Andreas, who you just heard. So he is, I think, he deployed the very first production Blitz application, like way back, like when it was like very early, and so he like went through lots of kind of challenges and me fixing bugs for him, and so he's he was a huge help in working out stuff there. And I think you have more than one Blitz application in production, right?
Yeah, and hopefully we'll reach 3 soon if we get NX working.
Awesome. Yeah. So, yeah, you always have great insights and input. So I'm excited to hear what you have for us. So you can take it away.
Cool. I'll go ahead and share my screen. Nothing to show yet. I'll just give me a sec. There we go. You guys can see my screen.
Yes.
Cool. So I'll just begin quickly introduce myself for those who haven't met me. So I'm Andreas, and I've kind of past 3 years, I bootstrapped a business called Flick, which is it began as an Instagram hashtag tool, which aims to solve similar problems to SEO, whereby hashtags are the means to be discovered and get impressions and followers, but it's very hard to navigate that space. How do you know if your hashtags are working, and how do you find them, all these different things. So we built that out, and through a very customer-centric approach, we ended up building out a variety of different other features that seem to be unsolved within the space, and now sitting around just under 22,000 paying users. So we've now scaled quite considerably, and now starting another business called Dweet, which is basically we're trying to bring the freelance world from into the luxury and fashion industry, and eventually to just the retail industry. One which is just, it completely doesn't exist, where it's abundant in software engineering and design, where you're able to kind of augment your team very easily with freelance workers, and also provides the flexibility to freelancers to be able to do their passions and also work part-time and things like that. We've definitely found it doesn't exist in this other space, so we're trying to basically create that. My kind of my approach to, I think I'm sharing the wrong screen actually. Can you guys see?
I see building with Blitz.
Oh, perfect. All right, Zoom's tricked me. So yeah, we're basically this, we're trying to take a very different approach to how freelance work works in this industry, and we're kind of approaching it from a technical aspect as well. So we're trying to build a lot of different automation and software to be able to run a recruitment agency, and also provide the ability to freelancers to be assigned to various clients. So I'm going to kind of work through, firstly, I kind of want to talk about how different problems I've come across building with Blitz, and methodologies that I was kind of strongly tied to in the traditional approach of a front end and a back end, and trying to mold those and fit them into Blitz. Sometimes it felt like I was trying to push a kind of a square into a triangle hole, but eventually I realized that the square can be changed in shape, definitely. And also the triangle in this case too, it's changed quite a lot. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well. And also it's going to be, it would be nice if there's a little bit conversational as well, because this is more about my approaches things I've discovered, and I've really had the opportunity to talk through with people about this. So I'm going to be asking a couple of questions if anyone has some feedback or different ways of approaching things. I'll also kind of prefix that the reason that I love Blitz so much is because I'm able to build features really, really quickly, end to end. I don't have to worry about this middle management between the back end and front end. And in my world, anything that can speed up the time between a feature being put in my hands in terms of a user story to being released into production is gold, because I think that's exactly what's missing in a lot of products that lack the user satisfaction is releasing things quickly. So what I found is Blitz allows you to do that in multiple ways, but there are also some considerations that you need to make with this new approach of working very quickly end to end. And I'm going to talk a little bit through about some things that I've had to consider when working in this new environment to allow me to work faster in every aspect, which includes things like how do I improve the usability of testing? How do I improve the usability of deployments through QA environments, which thanks to Blitz and having my whole application in one mono repo and I can run it all together, I'm able to now do things like spin up full stack environments on pull requests, which include a database and Redis and Elasticsearch and all these different things. So it can be QA'd in isolation and seeded. And that's quite a unique thing that we're able to do very easily with Blitz. So I want to present that a little bit. So basically, optimizations and improvements on top of Blitz workflow. So beginning, I'm just going to quickly go through folder structure, because I know this is one thing that some people love, some people don't care about, but this is kind of how I approach structuring different domains within Blitz. This test folder doesn't exist anymore. I usually write tests within the mutations or queries file or within a service. So the entities contain things like types, domain transfer objects, if you guys are familiar with those, and then things like overridden Prisma types, where sometimes you have like a JSON type for one of your database models, or one of the properties on one of your database models, and you want to override that so it makes it cleaner when using it. So those are defined in my entities folder. And I also kind of postfix file names, and I'll show you real quick. If I go into that specific folder, I have these entity postfix, and the same for services or workers. I'll postfix with dot worker, etc., just for clarity and simplicity. And then also nested domains, which you guys are probably familiar with. And then I have a folder for all the workers that are relevant to this specific domain. So this is to basically try and mitigate some of the issues of scaling Blitz projects, which I haven't come across yet, but I presume will happen. And the specific issues with scaling here would be clarity around what you need to change if you're editing a certain feature or coming in as a new developer. I want to change something. I need to know where I need to go, and I need to know that I'm not modifying anything that breaks something else. So I'm trying to isolate things as much as possible to keep that clarity. So next thing I want to talk about a little bit is a bit of a controversial one, and I spoke to Peter about this earlier today, provided a different methodology, but this is to kind of like help implement tests very, very quickly, and also make it very usable and reliable in executing those tests. And in a more like a traditional backend, I'd use a lot of dependency injection. I'd use a dependency injection container and all these different things. So in Blitz, I was trying to find a way to do that. So in a mutation, instead of testing the specific mutation, I'd define a service above this, or in a separate file if it's shared between other things, which defines this static get instance property, which returns an instance, whether it's being created or not. And I execute that with the same payload and maybe some information from the context. And then this allows me in a test then to test a specific service and mock out these dependencies that it relies on, so I don't have to worry about those. And one interesting thing actually Peter mentioned was, he was like, why don't you put these services inside the context? And then you're able to mock out the context. Firstly, I feel I really enjoy this service-based approach. And I'll show an example. This is the move candidate mutation. And inside here, I export this class, which is then used down here. I like the ability to test specific functions on a service, which I guess you can do by just exporting directly from this file. But I was actually interested in anyone, and if anyone else does dependency injection, if they do put things into the context, if they've had any problems with that, or any other approaches. If anyone here has experienced this at all.
So it's just me with context then.
You're always the fussy one, mate.
I think so. Some of us have like looked at hanging the database object off a context to like wrapping the database object with a proxy so that you can like do authentication at the database access level. So yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely a valid approach, is exploring the like adding them to context. But this is pretty clear too, because it's like, you know exactly like where the thing is coming from, versus if it's on context, it's like, how does that get here?
Yeah, it does make it very hard to trace the path of dependencies, isn't it? And one other thing that's probably nice about putting only the database in the context is it might make it easier for us to implement something like this. So I've been trying to find ways of parallel testing my Jest suites, because as the more tests they grow, the longer it takes with this sequential run. And finally, some different ideas are coming about. So this is an example test, Prisma test environment, where it'll define a random ID for the schema, the database URL here, and then it will like on setup, it will migrate the database, which may need to be changed slightly, and then drop it after. And then obviously in the test, it shouldn't look much different, except they've got some helpers here, because this is specifically for this Nexus. And they've got this like test environment, this Prisma environment, where they'll do a similar thing here. And if we had the ability to instead or pass the database into the service, I could then mock out that database altogether and create these helpers around it to set up different databases for each specific test suite. But I haven't tested this out yet, but I don't see any reason why it wouldn't work, even if you don't mock out, if you don't pass the databases into the dependency injection via parameters. So yeah, this is something I just wanted to comment on as well, that I think would be interesting to have baked into Blitz to make, again, testing a little bit simpler. I've come across different problems with when running parallel tests, things rely on each other and might be cleared at one point and modified at another, etc.
Yeah, I agree. We need to address that. I found it interesting that the way Next.js does this in their integration test is they have a layer, like basically a script on top of Jest that will take all the test files and divide them up to run them parallelly. So you can pass it in and say like, hey, divide the test into 6 different batches, and it'll run each batch in parallel, but each batch is its own like calling Jest with specific files and running those in series. And so it kind of just bypasses the whole like trying to do it with Jest or the database. It kind of does it as a layer above.
Okay, yeah, it's interesting. It might be a bit of a, I think that the benefits there come probably with speed. I think for us, for maybe a normal size repository, I think testing in parallel your Jest test suite, so this here, and testing all of these in parallel, but then the tests within one of these would run sequentially, I think would be, or even these in parallel as well is what's by default, I think. So I think if solving the problem of just having a separate testing environment for each of your test suites, or I forget what they're called, your top level describe in the file, I think should be sufficient without too much work. But it's an interesting idea. I'll definitely explore that. I imagine you're coming across a lot of interesting things that are implementing into the next repo. Now you're diving your hands into that. It's really cool, by the way. I appreciate what you're doing. So yeah, that's a little bit about testing the back end. Now, testing the front end is a little bit more frustrating. I've never really liked unit tests in the front end. So what I do is I have a blend between storybook snapshot testing. So you can see here, this is I use Chromatic. So what it does is it takes a screenshot of every component in the or every story, and it will compare that for each commit. You can define it on which branch it runs on. In my case, I only run it on main. And it will tell you if there are, say, unreviewed changes, and you have to review them for this to pass. So then in your PR, you can see whether you've messed up a button somehow, and it'll mess up everything else and cascade. So this is a nice way to really quickly implement tests for your front end, at least visually. And then for more functional side, I'll implement quite a lot of Cypress tests, as you guys are all probably familiar. I think it's really nice that we're able to do that. And again, the PR deployments I'll talk about later ties in quite nicely to it as well. But yeah, I mean, running Cypress in the, I think this is something Brandon talked about a few times. I think it's the best idea to run Cypress inside of say, inside just CI instead of relying on external URL somewhere else. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is logging. So it's really quite important to me, especially as I've tried to scale applications, is I want to move quickly. And one of those areas is I want to move quickly when trying to resolve issues. So having things like an ability to search all of my logs is really, really important to me. And I use services like Logs.io or ELK and different services to do that, depending on which one I prefer. What I've done there is, so I've implemented at the moment, because obviously Blitz is full stack, you need some kind of universal logger. I absolutely adore TS log. Fortunately, they don't provide support for the browser at the moment. I know, Brandon, you've opened up an issue in their repo, so I think they'll be working on it. But in the meantime, I've kind of wrapped the logger up here, and I resolve whichever one, depending on whether I'm on the server or in the browser. And I use universal logger, which is just another pretty logger for the browser. And both of these have these syncs, which then sync all of the logs into whatever service I'm using, Logs.io or my own hosted logging search service. And one interesting thing as well is TS log, they have an awesome feature where any error you pass in, it automatically captures the code frame in full stack. And this is really useful for debugging problems in production, where you can kind of find the log and then look at the stack trace. But what I found is after deploying this, especially with a large amount of logs, first cost a ton because there's a lot of data there. And secondly, it messes up when you're using things like Elasticsearch to index your logs, because it has a specific fixed index. Core stacks and more flexible JSON objects like this, they don't gel well with this fixed index that Elasticsearch requires. And I realized also as I was doing this, I was like, wait a second, I use Sentry for my errors, which has the stack trace and the source maps of the application. So what I did was I kind of built on top of my sync. I built this nice little, well, this is an example, by the way, of if you implement logging in the right way by placing it everywhere you think is relevant, it does become extremely useful for observability purposes. This is an example of I'm quite strict with myself. Whenever I'm catching an error, I'll log it. So this is kind of how I integrated Sentry with the logging system. So this is Logs.io on the right, and you can see there's a specific log, and this is an error. And I didn't want the stack trace in here, so what I did was instead I appended a URL to the Sentry issue. So this, I think, is if any of you are interested in really being able to debug things quickly, this is a quick implementation you can add to your code to make it super easy in production to test things. So what this does is basically this error ID is actually generated by Sentry. Whenever you write capture exception, it'll return an error ID. And then I've written this little function which basically converts that to the URL depending on what your project organization ID is and stuff like that. And then you can append that to your logs. So then you don't need to capture the stack trace in here. You can just have this link and click over and see all your lovely breadcrumbs and stack trace and all that stuff. So that's a little bit about logging. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was on this notion of observability and moving quickly from an infrastructure standpoint. I've invested quite heavily recently over the past 3 weeks in monitoring, and specifically I've introduced Grafana Prometheus. And this is also where I talk a little bit. I haven't got any more slides around the deployment, but I'm going to pause here and talk a little bit about deployment first before I move on to this actually. So I've just moved Blitz over from Render, even though it served me very well. I'm moving it over to Kubernetes. And I'll make a quick comment as well about there's a bit of like confliction between server or serverless. I tried very, very hard on deploying my applications in Versal, and I really want that to be the case. But it's just, I think it's way too early on in its development, and there are too many issues, especially if you want to scale it up a little bit and you're running very back-end heavy functionality with your full stack applications. You're going to have a lot of problems. Database pooling was one thing which really killed me. I migrated my database, my production database, which was used by hundreds of users daily or thousands of users daily, to be able to use the database pooling. So I went from AWS RDS, and I was like, oh great, RDS proxy. Oh no, I can't access it outside of VPC. Okay, then so let's go to DigitalOcean. But you don't realize that they offer database pooling, but they have limits that are very expensive to scale up. So I don't think we're ready there for that yet. I think unless you're using another database which has serverless baked in or connection pooling baked in, I don't think it's too feasible. So and also I really liked Versal because of speed, but when it was actually running it, and I actually paid for a very large database for connection pooling, a lot of money to test this out, and wasn't that much faster. And I have metrics which tell me that as well. So I think the benefits of having serverless it boiled down to, then it was like, if it's not faster significantly, then I really want. Then the next thing I was thinking about was, what about the benefits of unlimited scalability? I'm like, okay, because I had this issue with Flick where 2 weeks ago our application got DDoSed. So and it was hosted on Elastic Beanstalk, this provider in AWS, which kind of like wraps your deployment up. And it had auto scaling on, but it was a bit restricted. So it ended up going down for a minute or so, unfortunately. And I was like, oh, that would be great if we had serverless functions here. It would have just scaled up infinitely, no matter how expensive. And then I was like, but I get that out of the box very easily with Kubernetes. So for those who are not familiar, so I ended up, to conclude the story, I migrated all of my infrastructure on both of my businesses to Kubernetes, and it's been a dream. And it's not as scary as I initially thought. It took me 2 weeks to implement the whole thing, with all the beautiful things of like monitoring, the scaling, liveness, all these different things. Continuous deployment, just 2 to 3 weeks. So just a quick overview, Kubernetes, if anyone is not familiar, what it's basically, the premise is essentially you define all of your different deployments, applications, services, and these YAML files. And there are other different ways of defining these as well, but we'll stick to YAML files now. And in these YAML files, you can specify, it basically runs your applications in pods, which are similar to like Docker containers, and you specify an image, a Docker image, we'll run that, specify your environment variables, what ports it exposes, all these different things, and then you're able to then scale these pods up or down, and then these pods run on these things called nodes, which are your raw instances. It takes up and scales these pods up and down depending on the resource allocations you allocate to them. So what was really helpful here is I implemented that. And then if we then get DDoSed again, it basically just, I've set it to say this is the maximum amount of pods, and I've tested it, and I've scaled, I've allocated a lot of resources to testing this, and just scales the number of pods and then reduces them again. And then, so that's kind of like some nice to haves. Another nice to have around this setup is I'm able to, with Kubernetes, I can basically, you define all your YAML files, And then you can which define basically your application, maybe your workers, all these different things. You can package those up into things called Helm charts. And these Helm charts, what they do is they wrap your definitions up for your application, and then they provide these basically configuration outputs where you can specify things like, here's what my environment variables are, here's how many replicas are, I want an auto scaler on it, all these different things. Once you've done that, you can then use this lovely command where you write helm install and then the helm file, and it will with some settings, and then it will spin up all of your infrastructure in its own environment. Because Kubernetes is flexible in that all of your resources are allocated to different nodes, and it just doesn't use a whole server like a traditional way of deploying. You can actually now do things like host pull request environments just with this Helm chart. So basically, you make a pull request in one of these in your repo, and then it'll write Helm install with some specific configuration to make sure it's a unique environment. It will spin up then my Postgres, my Elasticsearch, my Redis. It will give me a URL, which I then use the Notion API to put into a nice table for the QA department, and it will receive the environment. And then when the pull request is closed, it will then kill all of those resources. And as I mentioned earlier, just to reiterate, these are pods. So you're not spinning up instances. Like, these are unallocated resources most of the time in your Kubernetes cluster that can just be used for these different things. So it made it really easy to achieve some beautiful development experience that improves the speed of development and workflows within the whole business, or both businesses. So once that was set up, and I'll actually come back to the monitoring. One nice thing also with Kubernetes is, because the thing that I was concerned about at the beginning was I'm very used to render and Elastic Beanstalk, all these things where I have like this nice log of yarn, build, blah, blah, blah. And then it starts and it's like, health checks passed, go. I wanted the same thing. So what I set up was this GitHub Actions path where basically this is actually with DigitalOcean, but moving to AWS, builds the image, logs into the container registry, pushes it to the container registry, updates your deployment file, which is your Kubernetes YAML, to have the new Docker image. And then it will then deploy the application Kubernetes, and it stops actually at this verify deployment stage, which is what you see on the right here, where Kubernetes, you can say, hey, I want to know the deployment status of a specific application. And then it will tell you, hey, we're currently rolling out your application, because in Kubernetes you specify, what they call like liveness, and I forget what the other one is called. But basically these definitions to say, ping this URL at this port to check if it's alive, and then when it's deploying, it'll basically progressively roll out these pods. And again, a nice thing about this is it's not spinning up new instances, installing your application, pinging that URL, waiting for it to pass, then replacing them, destroying old resources. They're just these lightweight pods. It's really, really fast to deploy things. Another beautiful thing about this. So here, the CI will actually pause on this rollout, and it will only pass if everything is, all of your replicas are deployed within the latest version. So this is kind of the replacement for your render logs, where it's like, this is your deployment status, it's live. So when it's complete job, it's successfully released and your health checks have passed. So that's kind of how I managed continuous deployment. I've got a URL here for setting up this exact flow here. This is another utility built by, I forget what they're called, but it's a really cool company. So once Kubernetes is set up, you then can use this service called Prometheus. So Prometheus, it basically, what it does is you give it some targets, and a target can be an endpoint of your application, and your application can expose metrics. And what it does is it scrapes those metrics periodically, stores them in a database, and then something called Grafana can then use that data to provide visualizations, alerts, and various other things. So here's an example of request time, which can be implemented very easily with Prisma middleware. You can write request time per endpoint to know kind of like how long things are taking, if we've got any bottlenecks anywhere, anything slower than it should be. And you can set up in Grafana very easily alerts to say, hey, if this drops on average over this period, send me a message to my phone or Slack or anything like that. So I think monitoring is something which is very easy to set up once you've got the environment going, and is also hugely beneficial for mental clarity. And I'll show you a quick example of what I mean by easy. And let me just get the code base up. I can show you live. And when I say mental clarity, like this has been huge for me, especially as like CTO kind of character, where if anything goes down, I'm responsible, so I want to know about it straight away. And I also want to know if I'm looking at this, I'm confident everything's working fine. There are no problems. So when I say easy, this is actually a Flick's backend, but it's the same implementation in Blitz. So you use this Node.js library called prom client. And here's an example for my Apollo metrics. You specify this thing called a counter, for instance, if you're looking for a counter. And then all you have to do is write parsed.increment with some specific labels, and then it will show up in your Grafana with basically these by querying this specific key here. And you may be wondering how it knows about that. The way it knows about it is, as I said, you expose a metrics endpoint, which looks something like this. I'm just exposing metrics on a specific port, and you write register, which is a function, which is a class, a method you get from prom client. You just return the metrics that it exposes. As simple as that. And then on Kubernetes side, there are some very nice Helm charts, like I described earlier, where you install them with maybe some small modifications of configuration, and then it automatically knows to scrape anything it can find that exposes metrics at the port that you define it. So now any of my developers can just spin up a service and then just say, point to this Prometheus, and it all just works, and it all appears in this dashboard. So that's how I manage monitoring. And again, it may sound a little bit complicated and convoluted, but once it's set up, it's really quite a beautiful thing to have, and scales quite nicely. And it really isn't as complicated as it looks. There's just a few concepts to learn. So that's kind of just a quick run through. And maybe the only thing I missed out that's important is I use Blitz.js for my jobs. I love that Quirrell library. I think it's Quirrell, right? It's phenomenal, but as I said, I'm very much server focused, and Blitz.js is quite ideal for that. And I've had a lot of experience with it before. In Flick, we're running thousands of concurrent jobs a second. So, and I know it scales. I know it works very well, and I can rely on it. And also, I've built these Prometheus exporters for Grafana, so I can see all of my active queues in a nice visualization way as well there. So yeah, that's it from me. Any questions? Anything to discuss? Now's the time.
That's really awesome. Thank you so much, Andreas. It's super cool to see this, because it's like you're like really in the trenches, and so it's great feedback. One question: what was the name of that thing that you used for there's Prometheus, which I think like provides the dashboard and stuff, and then what did you use inside your code? There's a library.
Oh yeah, it's called Prom Client.
Prom Client, and is that from Prometheus?
Yeah, well, I believe it's maybe community built. It's basically just an interface wrapper on top of Prometheus's API that exposes the metrics in the correct way and collects them in the correct way.
Okay, that's really cool. I'm gonna have to check that out.
Yeah, it's a cool piece of tech.
Yeah. And a quick question for the pod that's running Blitz. Are you using Nginx as a proxy, or are you running it straight with Node or NPM or PM2?
Sorry, could you repeat that again? I didn't catch the beginning bit.
Yeah, so the web application pod, I wanted to know what you're using to run the Blitz server. If it's just Node, if you're using a proxy, Nginx as a proxy, or something like PM2.
Yeah, good question. So this is actually one of the reasons why I'm not using DigitalOcean's Kubernetes is it made it very difficult for me to load balance my applications in a simple way. I don't want to worry about kind of like these proxies. In AWS, I specify the type of one of my services is load balancer. It will create a load balancer for me and provide an endpoint which I then could route to very easily and route 53 certificates all fine because it's kind of all baked into AWS and my certificate manager. So yeah, that's simplified it for me there.
Okay, we could probably talk about that part online.
Yeah,
Offline,
sure.
I mean, because you should be able to do that even in DigitalOcean.
Yeah, ping me a message. I have some problems because my certificates I can't download from AWS and import them back into the load balancer of DigitalOcean. But I'd love to hear your feedback on that. It'd be cool to play around in DigitalOcean. We've got some beautiful products. You know, they're very product orientated, and I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Yes, I have deployed my application on DigitalOcean Kubernetes, and load balancing just works out of the box. So they assign their own load balancers to your application, just like AWS.
Yeah, definitely. I think my problem was just I was aliasing the load balancer's IP to one of my routes in AWS, and to then set up auto redirect to HTTPS, I'll need a certificate in DigitalOcean, and I can't import my certificate from AWS. So yeah, it's just a couple of niggles there. I think if you have your domain set up in DigitalOcean, I think it's a good place to go. I just have maybe a couple problems with their pricing structure. I think it's quite expensive at the beginning, but then it becomes cheaper as you scale. I think the load balancers are a good example, and AWS is priced a little bit differently. And I want, because I do these PR request deployments, which include a load balancer, I'm going to be paying $10 a month per load balancer. It's not too ideal. On AWS, it works a little bit differently. Oh, by the way, Laurie, thank you for the Docker files in your repo. I appreciate the structure there. I had a little browse. I had some problem where I couldn't find my build files when I was running Blitz start. I was going to ping you about that, so I managed a little workaround.
Okay.
Nice one.
Hey, this is Martin here. Really amazing presentation. You've given me so much more confidence in the path and trajectory I'm on. I'm literally following you, but a few months behind. And you've given me a lot of confidence in what I'm doing. So, wow. Good job. Yeah, really good thing. But one thing I'd like to clarify, I didn't quite hear, and I'd like if you can elaborate. Did you say you are using a Redis server as a caching server or at all in your architecture? I didn't quite catch if you're using a Redis server or not. I didn't understand if you were or how you were using it.
Sure, yeah, of course I can elaborate. So I am using Redis along with quite a few other services like Elasticsearch for full text search. Redis, I don't use to cache any of my endpoint responses. It's very quick anyway. Where I use it is just to speed up some of my, it's funny, the first time that I began using it in Blitz was to mitigate some problems with sessions. I remember at the beginning, I don't know if you remember, Brandon, I had updating the session on a mutation ended up being really slow and added a lot of latency. So I started using Redis to cache the session data for a specific user. And that's primary use case. I also use it for Blitz.js because it's the backing for its queuing system.
Gotcha. The two-part question in that, I guess what I was kind of fishing for is, I think hidden in there, we all kind of wonder about this outstanding connection pooling issue. And I heard that you're also doing some large scaling scenarios with Kubernetes, and that seems to me that you would then run into connection pooling. And so then I thought, well, maybe that's how Redis is working in, or and the connection pooling conversation is, I must say, is where I have some fears that I have yet to conquer. So I wasn't quite sure what your learning was there, or how you're placing what sort of technology, or if you have any clarifications you could add regarding connection pooling, or anything you've learned that you could talk more about.
Yeah, definitely have a lot to comment there. So good question. So the difference between serverless and running a server. So I would scale out my Kubernetes pods to maybe a few hundred, maybe 300 in Flick. But keep in mind that Flick's at a scale where it needs 300 pods, which also means that it needs a pretty large database to handle its user base.
Ding ding. Yeah.
So yeah, what will happen is the database will have, say, up to 500 simultaneous or maybe it's a little bit more than that, 1,500, say, simultaneous connections, which wouldn't be the same if I was, say, at Tweet scale, where I need like 3 or 4 pods. But a normal database can definitely handle 4 simultaneous connections, which is the 4 simultaneous servers. So basically what I'm saying is, if you go for a server approach, you probably won't hit the connection pooling limit through running simultaneous replicas of pods, because you're probably going to scale your database up linearly with the number of pods that you're running based on the number of users that you have. But with serverless, you definitely hit those limits very quickly, because you may have only a handful of users, but
yeah, I see what you're saying. I think in my case, I must admit, I've done some vertical learning curve on serverless, and I understand it much more lately. And I think, like you, may be avoiding it, but I was looking at, scaling out more availability based on usership, and thinking, oh, well, that's going to automatically mean more connection capacity required, and you would need some sort of buffer, and that's maybe where you were putting your Redis server to take load off the back end database. That's just me abstracting what maybe you were doing, right? I think it all depends on how someone's building something out. I'm still on the fence. I'm still pre-architecting, if you will. I'm learning my way through. But you've given me a lot of confidence to keep going where I'm going. So I thank you for that.
No worries. Yeah, I'll just finish up with I'm very much an over optimizer, and I have a lot of anxiety about doing the right thing in any aspect of my life. And picking serverless was one of those things which I always felt like I should do, especially using Next.js. But what I'm coming to realize is, after attempting to do this for about a year now, and also running some very elaborate experiments where I can directly see the metrics, it's really not worth it from my conclusion at this point in time. And I definitely think there are a lot of use cases for it. And I think serverless is absolutely amazing. But in this specific situation, full stack application on Blitz, I think you're better off starting server 4, and then moving to serverless maybe when it's a little bit more mature later on, progressively.
Yeah, just this week I changed our deploy to Vercel page to have a big warning that says we do not recommend deploying to Vercel. So
Okay.
yeah, I agree. I think though, like maybe later this year, we'll maybe have some progress on deploying serverless, but we'll just have to see.
Wow, that's really interesting. I mean, I don't mean to interrupt the conversation, but I think a lot of the people in the room know I'm a newcomer to Blitz. I'm a new, web developer. I'm new to this community, and I stepped in. And I put this weight on my shoulders that, oh, serverless is the holy grail, right? But I've been learning my way through, and I hadn't gotten to the point of deployment success and then statistical metrics as Andreas has. So I cannot tell you my appreciation for this presentation. I really must say this presentation to me is so timely. I'm about to go into production. This has really just screwed my head on straight. So I can't thank you enough, and I'm just going to continue forward. And also I'm heading into the Azure space with Docker. And so the work that Lori has done, and then the new work that Docker file improvements to reduce the footprint, and your path too, Andreas, on trying to understand what you need to deploy to get the build right. Oh my God, we've all done that. So it's been a journey, I think, for all of us. But getting to you, Brandon, on changing the perception of when and where serverless can be, I think that's a real smart move. Tidying up readiness, or shall I say when to deploy or how to use serverless and in what scenarios. And in my architecture, I've divided my app into 4 major applications, and have designated one application to be serverless potential, and it would have the least amount of work to be converted to serverless if I wanted to do it. And I think that would be like a best practices kind of thing. So I appreciate your comments too, Brandon, because you really kind of outline when and where and how, and maybe it's not ready yet. So again, to both of you, thank you so much for this presentation. Just perfect timing. I can't tell you again.
Hi, Will here. I just had a real quick question just to Andreas about his comments on serverless and stuff. So approaching this kind of architecture where, for example, you might use something like FaunaDB, where you don't need to worry about even any kind of database sharding, scaling, any connection pooling, anything like this. So those services are sort of out there. Do you think that these services just need to mature before they become more sort of widely used? Or do you think that actually in their nature, they don't sort of support like the more kind of wider, more heavily scaled applications? So for example, with yourself, you have, a super large kind of Kubernetes cluster with a bunch of pods. All of that stuff I could sort of imagine being, all abstracted away into just some like RESTful, API requests to something like FaunaDB. So I wonder what your thoughts were on basically that, what needs to change before such a kind of approach is more readily used and maybe more stable. I wondered what your thoughts were on that.
I think firstly, I think it's mature enough now to use at scale for specific situations. Like I talk about those Blitz.js queues earlier. If they weren't at that scale, I started off using Lambda functions to execute them with a SQS queue backed. So the Lambda functions just listen to this queue and pull jobs out of it. But I ended up hitting problems with pricing, and it ended up just being better. I have a long running server which processes these jobs. So that was for me an example of like serverless works fine, just not in that situation. And then serverless works fine in that situation up into a limit, depending on kind of like your restrictions. I think, I don't know, for me that there are kind of tooling problems as well, where I run, say, my Blitz app on Versal, and maybe a Lambda function times out, or there is some other error, and I'll get an ambiguous response back to the user. I forget what the error is. It's like, I don't remember the error response, but it makes it very hard to track what basically send the errors back to the user correctly through the Lambda function. So I think there are just kind of like, there are a few, in my opinion, a few immaturities with the approach and the limits on how long they can run, the amount of memory, the startup, I think it's like cold startup problem was always an issue for me, especially when I tried running, say, a Apollo server on it. It was really hard to cache the schema, and I was building that schema live, and it was taking a while for the first few requests. And then I went back to my server, and it was all working beautifully without serverless, cheaper in some cases. So I think for me, at least, it is too early in a lot of aspects, but also very useful in some other aspects, like maybe some specific endpoints that you're running or services. It's quite nice, I think, in some situations where it might be a large team and you have very small Git repos for very isolated services, which have their own scripts to deploy their Lambda functions and are all monitored and tested. And, you know, they don't run very long, and you're not worried about, say, startup time, because it's a small repo and it doesn't have much startup overhead with that. And also I'll just add as well, like the end of the day, what we're trying to do here is build things for users. And this for me was why I jumped on Blitz as soon as I saw it right at the beginning, regardless of how evolved it was because it helped me achieve my primary goal, which is building and continuously adding features to products for users. And this serverless, overly focusing on serverless, just prevented me from doing that. And then moving back to serverful, I could just focus on the product again and implement things quickly with all the beautiful tooling that Blitz has. So I always kind of return back to that philosophy of like, go for it if you're interested in something like serverless and it seems cool and you see there being some benefits, but if it's really restricting you on a day-to-day basis to achieve what you're trying to achieve, then just kind of go with what might be maybe a suboptimal solution for the sake of your end goal. And I mean, maybe your end goal is enjoyment and you want to experience serverless for your own sake and it's not for your users or anything, then maybe go ahead then. But I think in most cases, remember what your end goal is and revisit that.
That's great. Thank you very much.
That's right, mate.
Anyone else have a question?
What's the current state of the NX problem? Or is there being worked on? Or?
The what problem, sorry?
The NX monorepo.
Amex.
NX, Narwhal.
Oh, NX. Okay, sorry, Laurie. Yes, that's also something that's very dear to my heart because I built Flick on NX, separate front end and back end, and I tried really hard to do this like square thing to a triangle again, but I think I forget the issues. There is one issue that was there was an issue that was created on NX's repo, and I posted a loom there with how I managed to get it working, but there were still quite a few problems. And I think from how I remember it, they resided in us not having full control over Next.js. So it would be nice to probably revisit that after Brandon's finished merging everything with Next.js. But I think it's another. I think there's another issue with if you're looking to use NX and Blitz for the sake of moving Blitz into your NX repo, I think there are going to be a few issues. Like for myself, for example, my backend is very much set up in a way where it would be hard to move things over to the front end. It's like, what do I move? When do I implement my Blitz mutation and not my backend Apollo client? I think there's a lot of problems there. But if you're setting up NX from scratch in Blitz, I think it would be a massive improvement to scaling Blitz apps. And I'm definitely going to migrate Blitz over to, Dweet over to NX Blitz as soon as it arrives. It's just like, there's so many beautiful things about NX with its like dependency caching and kind of like mapping all of your different isolated services. So yeah, sorry, it's a bit of a long-winded answer, but I think we'll probably talk about that offline. I'll send you the issue and maybe we can chat about what the next steps there, because I'm really keen to move with that.
Okay, thanks.
Once we get the Next.js fork integrated, then all those issues should basically go away. Yeah, it's going to solve so many problems. Okay, I'll take one more question. And if not, thank you very much, Andreas. I think you could talk every time and we'd be happy.
I'm pleased I could help.
So if you are interested in speaking at a future meetup, please let me know. I have somebody doing the lightning talk for next time, but the main presentation is open. So if you're interested in that, please talk to me, let me know. And thank you so much. Have a good rest of your day.